Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
For as long as I can remember, there has always been an unspoken rule in my family, a rule so deeply ingrained in the way we function that no one ever questioned it, no one ever argued against it, and no one ever considered the weight it placed on me. My younger brother, Eric, was the one who needed help, and I was the one who gave it. It didn't matter what the situation was, didn't matter how many times he failed, didn't matter how often he made the same mistakes. I was always the one expected to pick up the pieces, to smooth things over, to make sure he never had to face the full consequences of his own irresponsibility. I can still hear my mother's voice, that carefully rehearsed mix of concern and exasperation, the way she would sigh as if the entire situation was somehow my fault for not anticipating it sooner. "Honey, you know your brother isn't as strong as you," she would say, like it was the simplest fact in the world, like it was just something I should accept without question. "You've always been the one who could handle things. He needs more help than you do." And every single time, no matter how much I wanted to scream, no matter how much I wanted to refuse, no matter how much resentment clawed at the edges of my patience, I did what was expected. Because that was the role I had been given, and there was never a moment in my life when I was allowed to step outside of it. It started small, the way these things always do, the kind of favors that seemed harmless at first, the kind of sacrifices that felt temporary until you realized they had become permanent. When we were kids, I was the one who helped him with his homework while our mother hovered nearby, watching approvingly as I made sure he understood things he could have learned himself if he had just tried a little harder. When we were teenagers, I was the one covering for him when he blew off his responsibilities, making excuses to teachers, smoothing things over so he wouldn't get in trouble, listening to my parents tell me how grateful they were that I was such a good sister. And when we became adults, when the stakes got higher and the consequences became real, I was the one paying his rent when he couldn't make ends meet, the one loaning him money I knew I would never see again, the one picking up the phone at all hours of the night because he had, yet again, made a mess of his life and had no idea how to clean it up. It was never framed as a demand, never outright forced upon me, but the expectation was always there, woven into the very fabric of our family dynamic, reinforced in every single conversation, every sigh, every disapproving look when I even hesitated to help. And if I ever dared to question it, if I ever even suggested that Eric should learn to stand on his own 2 feet, my parents would just shake their heads, their disappointment thick in the air, reminding me once again that I was strong and he was not. And strong people, according to them, didn't turn their backs on family, no matter how much it cost them. I tried to justify it to myself for years, tried to convince myself that I wasn't being used, that I was choosing to help, that I was just doing what any good sister would do. But the truth is, I wasn't making a choice. I had never been given a choice. And the longer it went on, the more exhausted I became, the more I started to resent the fact that no one, not once, had ever asked me if I needed help, if I was okay, if I was tired of carrying a weight that was never supposed to be mine. It wasn't just the money, though that part had started to sting more and more as the years went by, as I watched Eric spend his days doing whatever he wanted while I worked myself into the ground just to keep everything together. It was the sheer unfairness of it, the realization that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I accomplished, none of it would ever matter as much as Eric's latest crisis. I could pay his rent for years, keep him afloat for years, sacrifice my own financial stability for years, and the second I even considered stopping, the second I even thought about putting myself first, I was suddenly the selfish one, the cruel one, the bad daughter who didn't care about her family. The cycle went on, repeating itself like some twisted, inescapable pattern, until one day, I finally let myself think the thing I had been too afraid to admit for years. What if I just stopped? What if I didn't pick up the phone the next time Eric called? What if I didn't send the money, didn't cover the rent, didn't swoop in to fix the damage like I always did? What if, for the first time in my entire life, I let him deal with the messes he made himself? The thought terrified me, not because I cared about what would happen to Eric, because I knew what would happen to Eric, but because I had no idea what my parents would do when they realized I was no longer playing my part in their perfect little arrangement. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for me to reach this moment, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the familiar name flashing across the screen, sending a sharp, bitter pang through my chest before I even opened the message. Eric is being evicted. You need to do something. I stared at the words for a long time, my fingers tightening around the phone, my breath coming out in slow, measured exhales as the weight of that single sentence settled over me like a suffocating fog. My mother's tone, even through text, was the same as it had always been: expectant, demanding, laced with that familiar assumption that of course I would step in, of course I would fix it, of course I would do what I had always done. But this time, for the first time, I wasn't so sure. And that terrified them far more than it terrified me. I stared at my phone, rereading the message over and over again, waiting for the familiar rush of panic or obligation or guilt to take over, waiting for the automatic response to kick in, waiting for the part of me that had spent years fixing things to rise up and do what it had always done. But instead, for the first time in my entire life, I felt absolutely nothing. No urgency, no sense of responsibility, no desperate need to make things right, just a hollow kind of exhaustion that settled deep in my chest, pressing down on me like a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to breathe without it. Eric is being evicted. You need to do something. The words sat on the screen, cold and impersonal, but I could still hear my mother's voice in my head, could still picture the way she would be pacing the kitchen, one hand on her forehead like she was carrying the weight of the world, her voice rising in that carefully constructed mix of concern and disappointment. She had spent my entire life perfecting the way she spoke to me, the way she framed things in a way that made it impossible for me to say no, the way she always made it sound like helping Eric wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only thing to do. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly as I let the weight of it settle over me, let myself feel the exhaustion of all the years I had spent putting out his fires, covering for his mistakes, making sure he never had to deal with the real consequences of his own actions. I had spent years cleaning up his messes, giving him second chances, sending money I couldn't afford to lose, and every single time, I told myself it would be the last time, that this time, he would finally learn, that this time, he would finally grow up. But deep down, I had always known the truth. He was never going to change because he had never needed to. I thought back to the last time I had helped him, the last time I had allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be different. He had called me in the middle of the night, his voice slurred and frantic, going on about how his rent was overdue and his landlord was threatening to kick him out, how he swore this was the last time, how he had a plan, how he was just waiting on a job offer, how he just needed one more chance. And like an idiot, like the fool they had raised me to be, I sent him the money, wired it straight into his account without a second thought, because that was what I had been trained to do. Because I had spent my entire life believing it was my job to make sure he was okay. And then, less than a week later, I saw the pictures on social media. Eric, out at a bar with his friends, grinning like he had never had a single worry in his entire life, flashing a bottle of expensive whiskey in one hand and a stack of poker chips in the other. My money, gone in a single night, wasted on alcohol and gambling and whatever else he had decided was more important than the rent he had sworn he couldn't pay. I hadn't even confronted him about it, hadn't even told him I knew, because deep down, I wasn't even surprised. I had just sat there staring at the screen, feeling something inside me crack wide open, something raw and bitter and permanent, something that told me I couldn't do this anymore, that no matter how much my parents tried to convince me otherwise, no matter how much they told me it was my responsibility, I didn't owe him anything. I looked down at my phone again, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart pounding as I typed out two simple words, words that felt so unfamiliar, so foreign, so utterly unlike me that I almost couldn't believe I was sending them. That's not my problem. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before I could let the guilt creep back in, before I could convince myself that I was being cruel, before I could fall back into the same endless cycle I had spent my entire life trapped in. And then, before I could even take another breath, my phone started ringing, my mother's name flashing across the screen in big, bold letters, the sharp vibration rattling against the table like some kind of alarm. Like some kind of warning that I had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I stared at the phone, my pulse hammering in my ears, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my entire body tense as I braced myself for what was coming next. I already knew exactly what she was going to say. I already knew exactly how this conversation was going to go. But for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't afraid of it. And that, more than anything, was what terrified her. The moment I answered the phone, my mother's voice exploded through the speaker with a sharpness that made it sound like she had been holding her breath, barely able to contain her fury, waiting for me to pick up just so she could unleash the storm that had been building. There was no greeting, no pretense of concern, no attempt to mask the sheer disbelief in her voice, just the immediate, cutting accusation that landed like a slap across the face. "How could you say that?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of outrage and desperation, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to make me understand just how wrong I was. "How could you just sit there and say that this isn't your problem? He is your brother, for God's sake. He is family. You don't just turn your back on family when they need you the most." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temple as I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me like a wave I had been pulled under too many times before, feeling that old, familiar weight settle in my chest, the weight of expectation, the weight of obligation, the weight of knowing that no matter what I did, no matter how much I gave, it was never going to be enough. "Mom," I said, my voice carefully measured, deliberately calm in a way that only made her angrier. "I am not turning my back on anyone. I am just choosing not to fix this, because it is not my job to keep saving him every time he screws up. He is a grown man, and if he can't figure out how to pay his rent, then maybe that's something he should be dealing with, not me." There was a brief, stunned silence, a silence so rare that I could almost feel the way she was scrambling to come up with the next argument, the next guilt trip, the next carefully crafted manipulation designed to make me feel like I was the one who had done something wrong. And then, just as I expected, her voice came back, sharp and incredulous, carrying that same unwavering conviction she had always had when it came to Eric. "This isn't about him screwing up," she snapped, her breath coming fast and uneven like she was struggling to hold back tears, though I knew better than to believe she would actually cry over this. "This is about you being cruel. This is about you abandoning him when he needs you. He is going to lose everything, and you are just sitting there acting like it doesn't even matter." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head despite the fact that she couldn't see me, feeling something deep inside me crack open, something that had been held together by sheer force of will for far too long. "Mom, he has already lost everything before," I said, my voice firmer now, more certain, more tired. "And every single time, you and Dad have made sure he never actually had to deal with it, never had to fix it, never had to learn anything from it, because you always made sure someone was there to pick up the pieces for him. And every single time, I have been the one paying for it. I have given him years of my life, I have given him thousands of my own money, and none of it has ever changed a damn thing. So tell me, Mom, when exactly does it stop? When exactly do I get to say that I have done enough?" I heard her sharp intake of breath, heard the way she hesitated for just a second, as if she hadn't actually expected me to push back, as if she had convinced herself that I would eventually give in just like I always had. But before she could speak, my father's voice broke through the chaos, quieter than hers, but no less determined, carrying the weight of something he had clearly been holding onto for a long time. "Sweetheart," he said, his tone carefully even, his words chosen with the kind of precision that told me he was trying to sound reasonable, trying to frame this as a logical conversation rather than an emotional outburst. "No one is saying that Eric has been perfect, and no one is saying that this has been fair to you. But he is your brother, and at the end of the day, we only have each other. If you don't help him, then who will? You know as well as I do that if you don't step in, he is going to end up homeless. Do you really want that on your conscience?" I let his words settle in the air between us, Let them hang there like a heavy, suffocating weight, the same weight that had been placed on my shoulders so many times before. And then, just when I thought I had heard everything, just when I thought I had already accepted the truth of where I stood in this family, my father sighed heavily, his voice dropping just slightly, as if he was about to admit something he had never said out loud before. "You've always been the strong one," he said finally, his words slow and deliberate, the weight of them sinking into my chest like a stone. "We always knew you would be fine on your own. But Eric was never going to make it without us. That's just the way things are, honey. That's how it's always been." And that was it. That was the moment. The moment I realized that I had never been seen as equal, that my successes had never actually mattered, that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I accomplished, I had only ever been the backup plan. I had only ever been the insurance policy, the one they could rely on to pick up the pieces, the one they could count on to make sure Eric never had to suffer. The one they never had to worry about because I had been forced to figure out how to survive without them a long, long time ago. I felt something inside me harden, something that had been soft for far too long, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the final, undeniable proof that I had never been the priority, that I had never been given the choice to say no. That my entire life had been shaped around making sure he never had to feel what it was like to fail. I inhaled slowly, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached, forcing myself to hold back the wave of emotions crashing through me, forcing myself to steady my voice before I spoke. "I have to go," I said simply, my words clipped and final, leaving no room for argument, leaving no room for guilt, leaving no room for them. And before they could say another word, before they could try to pull me back into the endless cycle of expectation and obligation, I pressed my finger against the screen and ended the call. I stared at the phone in my hands, feeling the sharp sting of something I couldn't quite name, something that felt like both devastation and relief, something that told me that even though I had just lost something, even though I had just burned a bridge that had been holding me hostage for years, I had also just freed myself from it. For the first time in my entire life, I had chosen me. The week passed in slow, heavy stretches of time, each day carrying the lingering weight of the last conversation I had with my parents, each night punctuated by the occasional vibration of my phone as yet another message came through, each one more desperate than the last. At first, I ignored them, refusing to even glance at the screen, refusing to let their words pull me back into the cycle I had spent my entire life trapped in, refusing to let their carefully crafted guilt seep into my bones the way it always had before. But eventually, curiosity won out, and one evening, as I sat curled up on my couch with nothing but the soft glow of the television flickering in the background, I finally opened the messages, scrolling through them with a detached kind of interest, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. "I hope you're happy. Your brother has nowhere to go. You've abandoned your family. I never thought you were capable of such cruelty. He's your brother, for God's sake. Don't you care? I can't believe you're doing this to us." Each message carried the same undertone of disbelief, the same refusal to acknowledge that this situation had been years in the making, the same unwavering certainty that this was somehow my fault, that the responsibility for Eric's survival had always belonged to me, that my refusal to keep playing the part they had written for me was the true crime here, not the years of enabling, not the years of covering for him, not the years of making excuse after excuse while he continued to burn every opportunity he had ever been given. I stared at the words for a long time, waiting for the usual rush of guilt to take hold, waiting for the familiar, suffocating urge to fix things, to make it better, to undo the damage they believed I had caused. But it never came. Instead, all I felt was a strange, quiet sort of relief, a clarity I had never experienced before, the sharp realization that I was finally free of the burden that had been crushing me for so long I had stopped noticing the weight of it. And then, just as I was about to put my phone down, another message appeared, this time from Eric himself, the name flashing across the screen like a final, inevitable confrontation, a reminder that I had not only walked away from them, but from him as well. I hesitated for only a second before opening it, already knowing exactly what it would say, already bracing myself for the anger, for the accusations. For the carefully constructed words designed to make me feel like the villain in a story I had never wanted to be a part of in the first place. Wow! So that's it, huh? You just decided you're too good for your own family? You really don't give a damn what happens to me, do you? I lost everything because of you. You know that, right? You were supposed to help me. That's what family does. But I guess you don't care about that. I guess you only care about yourself. I always knew you were selfish, but I never thought you'd actually do something like this. Congratulations. Hope you enjoy your perfect little life while I'm out here with nothing. I let out a slow breath, pressing my phone against my thigh, letting my head fall back against the couch as I closed my eyes, absorbing the words, feeling them settle deep inside me, waiting for them to hurt the way they were supposed to. Waiting for them to crack through the wall I had so carefully built. But they didn't. They just existed. Nothing more, nothing less. Because the truth was, I had given a damn what happened to Eric. I had spent years giving a damn, years throwing everything I had into making sure he never had to suffer, years sacrificing my own peace, my own stability, my own happiness just to keep him afloat. I had given so much for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to exist outside of him, to live a life that wasn't built around making sure he never had to struggle. But the other truth, the one that had taken me far too long to accept, was that none of it had ever been enough. And none of it had ever been my responsibility in the first place. I set my phone down on the coffee table, exhaling slowly as I stretched out my legs, letting the tension drain from my shoulders, letting the weight of the past slip away, letting myself breathe in the kind of freedom I had never known before. And then, just as I was starting to enjoy the silence, just as I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was over, my phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with one final message, one final desperate attempt to pull me back in. Please, I don't know what to do. It was from my mother. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't have an answer. I sat there for what felt like forever, my phone resting against my palm, the glow of the screen casting a faint light across the dim room, my mother's message staring back at me as if waiting for an answer I was no longer willing to give. The words felt different this time, not like a demand, not like an expectation, not like a carefully crafted manipulation designed to pull me back into a life I had spent years trying to escape, but instead, like something raw, something desperate. Something that carried the weight of someone who had just realized, far too late, that the thing she had always relied on wasn't there anymore. Please, I don't know what to do. It was the first time she had ever admitted something like that to me, the first time she had ever let herself sound unsure, the first time she had ever spoken to me as if I was the one with the power, instead of the other way around. For so many years, she had held the strings, she had dictated the terms, she had shaped the narrative so carefully that I had never once stopped to question whether or not I had the right to pull away. But now, the strings had been cut, the illusion had been shattered, and the roles had been reversed in a way she had never anticipated, in a way she had never prepared for. I let out a slow breath, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, my mind racing through every possible response, every possible way I could handle this, every possible way I could soften the edges of what I had already done. I could ignore it, pretend I never saw it, let it sit there unread until she got the message without me having to say a single thing. I could call her, let her cry, let her beg, let her tell me all the ways I had failed them, all the ways I had changed, all the ways I had disappointed them by finally choosing myself. I could take it back, undo it all, pretend like the past few weeks had been a mistake, let them pull me back into the life they had created for me, let them convince me that this was who I was meant to be. Let them make me believe that I had never really wanted to leave in the first place. But none of those things felt right. None of those things felt like me anymore. So instead, I typed out two simple words, words that had been a long time coming, words that should have been said years ago, words that felt like closing a door I had never realized was open in the first place. Not anymore. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before I could let the weight of the past pull me back in, before I could give her the chance to twist my words into something they weren't. And then, without another thought, I set the phone down beside me, exhaling as I leaned back against the couch, letting the silence settle around me, letting the finality of what I had done sink in, letting myself feel the weight of it in a way I never had before. For the first time in my life, there was no guilt, no anxiety, no lingering fear of what came next. There was no waiting for the inevitable backlash, no bracing myself for the consequences, no wondering if I had made a mistake. There was just peace. A quiet, steady peace that filled every empty space inside me. A peace that told me that I had done the right thing, that I had made the right choice, that I had finally chosen myself over the people who had spent my entire life convincing me that I was nothing more than a tool to be used. I looked around at the life I had built, the home I had made for myself, the space that was entirely mine, untouched by their expectations, untouched by their demands, untouched by the weight of everything they had placed on my shoulders for so many years. And for the first time, I saw it for what it really was, not just a place to escape to, not just a temporary refuge, but my life, my world, my future. My phone buzzed again beside me, the vibration breaking through the quiet, another message flashing across the screen, another attempt to pull me back in, another desperate plea for something I was no longer willing to give. But this time, I didn't even bother looking.